The planet was Gethsemane. The terraformers had wanted to make it into a paradise. The war had turned it into hell. Gethsemane had been one of the more developed frontier worlds, with its own heavy industry and a population numbering in the hundreds of millions. That was lower now, of course, but it was still a vital strongpoint. Whichever side held it could supply their forces across the sector from its output. The Kurzaskarar, as the officers liked to call them, had landed on the eastern continent early in the war and dug in. The colonial forces had held on to the western and southwestern continents, where most of the population and industry were, but they hadn't been able to dislodge the enemy beachhead. The campaign had ground on, lines moving back and forth. The shield umbrella was so extensive now, you could probably walk from one side of the planet to the other without leaving its protection. Extensive, but not unbroken. Every so often an attack would succeed in breaking through, take down the enemy shield emitters. That was never easy, of course. Every emitter was heavily guarded by layers of trenches and bunkers, and built to withstand rockets, energy weapons, and EMPs. But it happened, and when it did, the orbital bombardment would begin. Large parts of Gethsemane were either covered in fortifications or pockmarked wasteland from where the fortifications had been erased by the ships in orbit. I learned the rhythm of battle pretty quickly. Approach the shield terminus, where the energy barrier met the ground, preferably from an angle where the enemy positions didn't have line of sight on you. Dig a hole underneath without breaking the surface, and hope they don't see you do it. Shore up the hole and excavate enough of a tunnel for 2 Marines in armor to stand shoulder to shoulder. Any narrower than that, and you won't be able to retreat. If you've got time, make it large enough to get a vehicle through, but you won't have time because the knifers always react before then. That was the preferred military slang, by the way, knifers. The Kurzaskarar had a weird fetish for battle knives and used them every opportunity they got. Not that they didn't have plenty more dangerous weaponry. If you had time to get a tunnel under the shield at all, they'd likely show up before you'd got the whole platoon through. If they were really early, you'd be forced back with grenades and rockets. Ballistic artillery was useless because shells would just hit the shield, so you had to get quite close to use explosives. But if you had time to form a perimeter inside the shield umbrella, they would attack with energy rifles. I knew those energy bolts all too well. I still had a little scar on my shoulder as a reminder of my first encounter with them. Sometimes they drove us back. Sometimes we drove them back. The first few battles I was in were really just skirmishes. Then they sent us to the mountains. There was one long mountain chain separating the western and eastern continents that formed a natural defense for the enemy to build their main fortification line. 2 months into my tour on Gethsemane, the Navy finally got back full orbital control again, having fought several fleet battles to drive the enemy's ships out of the system. They never stayed away for long, so the brass decided now was time for a major ground offensive. The original name for the mountains had been something dry and academic. Tectonic Formation Alpha, something like that. At some point during the long and bitter slaughter over them, someone had given them a real name, Golgotha. I'd never seen mountains until that first dawn riding the transport shuttle out to the forward bases. You can't imagine what it was like to see the sun rising over the peaks for the first time, glinting off the ice. They said the Golgotha chain was higher than the Himalayas in places, although I'd never seen them either. All I knew was that in their shadow, suddenly all the vast might of the 2 opposing armies seemed small. We could kill each other here for 1,000 years, and the mountains would still be there just the same as ever. They gave us some perfunctory training in using oxygen masks. Then they sent us in. First shield was easy. The roaches, sorry, but I'll never stop calling them that, knew we were coming, but command had disguised the buildup and feinted towards the north the day before, drawing away their forces. We took them by surprise, and had 3 full platoons under the shield barrier before they realized what was going on. Once they opened up on us, our short-range heavy mortars started firing to crater the ground, giving us cover. Then we advanced. I was in a squad with Aaron and Yukio, 2 boys called Garrett and Eli we'd met in basic, and 5 more guys who were on their second tour, including the Corporal Lee. Never found out if that was a first name or a second name. We were the third squad under the shield, and we were able to get a good 200 meters before the bolts of energy started hissing past us. Then, explosions, as the mortars blew up mushrooms of earth in front of us. We slid into the craters, took a breather, then started scrabbling up the opposite side. In position, we started firing, laying down cover for the squads behind us. Crater, advance, until we were within 100 meters of their shield emitter. Then there was an explosion inside the barriers protecting the emitter, not even sure whether it was a lucky mortar shot or one of our squads had made it inside, and the shield snapped off. One moment we were pushing forward, then we were running back, so the guns of the battleships in orbit could scrape the ground clean. The next shields weren't so easy. The further up the mountain we went, the harder it got. Several times we were forced to pull back and regroup. Once one of our squads didn't make it back to the tunnel before the enemy collapsed it with a grenade. I watched them from the other side of the shield, just a few meters away, as they were pushed back up against the almost invisible barrier, trapped, panicking and begging for help, before one by one they were cut down. The enemy came forward to finish the last survivors with knives. I'd never seen them that close before. They were always just a shadow in the distance. 4 spider-like legs, all connected to the same point at the bottom of the abdomen. 4 arms, 1 pair on the abdomen and 1 pair on the torso. I couldn't see it under their armor, but I knew their exoskeleton was black and chitinous, like a scorpion. I could see their faces. Their mouth parts were almost wasp-like, but their eyes, they had 4 of them, 2 on either side of their head that were black, but the 2 that faced forward were disturbingly like ours. The knives plunged into the dying Marines, and they chanted, "Kurzasker, Kurzasker!" I don't know what they got out of that, but whatever it was, those particular roaches didn't have time to enjoy it for long, because we popped that shield that afternoon. Then it was tunnel fighting, clearing out bunkers driven deep into the mountainside. Darkness and terror, pushing through narrow passages knowing that the enemy could be around any corner. I remembered what that felt like all too well. First 2 days, our battalion took 30% casualties. Could have been worse. Our squad lost 2 guys, 1 missing a leg, 1 dead. Didn't know him well, but it was still tough watching the medics zip up the body bag. Replacements arrived with ours, and we kept pushing forward. 3rd day, we were past the first mountain and in the valley beyond. Would have been a nice place if you didn't need an oxygen mask to breathe properly. The valley was covered by a single shield emitter sitting by a lake. We had to circle round the edge of the shield for quite a way before we found a spot that wasn't covered by the enemy's bunkers. The tunneling started before dawn. 6 companies, over 1,000 Marines. We got maybe half of them through before the enemy realized it wasn't a feint and counterattacked. The air was so full of lights it was like they were putting on a firework display for us. Stick your head up out of the crater and you'd get it shot off. That was what happened to Garrett. He tried to take a peek, and then he fell back down with the top of his head missing. They had us pinned down pretty good at first, and I thought that the officers would have to order the retreat back under the shield. But then the rocket launchers moved up and started taking out the heavy weapon nests. That gave us just enough breathing space to open up the bridgehead and start pushing them back. It was still a slaughter. Diving from cover to cover, snapping off a few shots, then having to get down as they turned the rapid-fire energy blasters on you. I was lying on my back in a crater, watching bolts flicker past just a meter above my head and wondering why the hell I'd volunteered for this when Erin shook my arm. "What?" I asked, and then I saw what she was pointing at. Corporal Lee was on his back too, eyes wide, staring up at the sky. Except he wasn't looking at anything anymore. Not with that big hole through his chest. "What do we do?" she asked. "We should go back," Eli said. "Link up with another squad." "No," I said firmly. "That would just put us in the line of fire again. Then we'd just be sent forward again anyway. We hold this position. Wait for reinforcement." Yukio was the only one still firing, bobbing up, snapping off a shot, then repositioning. Calmly and methodically, like she was still on the range back at basic. I pulled her down into the crater. I didn't want the enemy focusing on us, not while we were so exposed. Just hold this little salient, wait for the rest of the company to catch up, Then we could start pushing forward again. Except they didn't catch up. Instead, it was the enemy that started pushing forward, and I realized I'd fucked up, because it was now too late to go back. They were covering our escape route. The good news was that in order not to mow down their own soldiers, the heavy weapons had lightened up a bit. We could at least move now, and although going back was now off limits, the ground to our right sloped downwards, giving us some cover. I told the others to get ready to make a break for it. Not everyone was convinced. "We should be heading back to the shield," one of the older guys hissed at me. Marcos, I think his name was. "If we don't get back before the knifers reach it." He didn't need to finish that sentence. Everyone knew you had no chance if the enemy reached the shield before you did. "We won't make it if we try to go back," I told him firmly. "We're too far forward. This is our only route out. We head that way." I gestured to our right. "Get away from the main combat line here and try to find a quieter spot to dig under the shield." "Listen to her." Aaron backed me up. "She usually knows what she's talking about." Did I? How did I know which path led to life and which path led to death? Was I using the experience I'd gained in basic training and the weeks we'd already spent on Gethsemane to judge the best option? Or was I just throwing the dice? How do you make that choice, knowing that if you choose wrong, you die? "You guys do what you like," said Yukio, deadpan as usual. "But I'm sticking with Leah. Trusting in your friends is one way to choose. Wish I'd had that luxury, but I didn't. It was on me to make a decision. So I did. I guess I'll never really know if I made the right call because I was smarter or because I got lucky. But one by one, we rolled out of the crater and started sliding down the slope, towards the lake, keeping low as the sounds of weapons fire receded in the distance. The shores of the lake were overgrown with reeds and rushes, the perfect hiding place. I led us along the shoreline a little way, hoping that when I saw the route out, it would be obvious. Then I looked across the lake, and I had an idea. "Have we got sandbags?" I asked. Sometimes one person per squad was issued a roll of plastic bags that could be used for field fortifications. Marcos raised his hand. "What are you thinking?" Aaron asked. "I'm thinking about going for a swim." Quickly, I explained my plan to them. We'd make the sandbags into flotation devices using the oxygen from our tanks. We'd have to leave most of our gear behind, including our armor. Too heavy. Just take our weapons and our breathing gear, and some explosives. While the enemy were concentrating on pushing back the rest of the battalion to the shield, we'd paddle across the lake. Take it nice and slow, look like just a couple of pieces of driftwood. And hopefully any guards around the shield emitter on the opposite shore would be focused on the fighting in the distance, rather than 8 jarheads wearing nothing but shorts and t-shirts. Why did they choose to follow me? I had no authority. They could have left me to get myself killed and got back to base on their own. No one would have blamed them, but without even really arguing about it, they started stripping off and inflating the sandbags. The mood wasn't exactly confident, but I think we all felt the potential payoff was worth the risk. When you don't know what to choose to do the right thing. That lake was a lot bigger than it looked from the shoreline. Colder, too. Even in bright sunshine, that fresh mountain water was not too far from freezing. But we made it across, to our surprise. Although we weren't half as surprised as the guards on the wall around the shield emitter. We shot them down before they even noticed we were there, planted the demo charges, and then had to fight our way out. Marcos got hit in the leg as we were pulling back. Clean shot, through the muscle, but he had to be carried out. Yukio, Eli, and me stayed behind to keep the roaches back while the others carried Marcos out. Aaron on point. I honestly thought that was going to be how I died. Once we'd given the others time to get clear, I'd order Yukio and Eli out of there, then hold them back until the charges blew. My stupid idea, so if anyone stayed behind, it should be me. That was mostly what I was thinking. But there was a part of me that thought, if I got to choose how I died, this would be it. At least this was worth dying for. Not standing in half-finished trenches with a militia that barely knows how to fire their guns, facing an enemy you don't stand a chance against. Not huddled in a muddy alley trying to shield your child. Not alone in the dark, terrified, as the monsters closed in. I wasn't looking for a family reunion, but if I did ever get to see my parents and my brother again, I wanted to be able to tell them that my death wasn't like theirs. My death meant something. Then the roaches realized we'd already rigged the emitter to blow and broke off their attack to try save it. I almost went after them to try and keep them from disarming the demo charges, but Yukio grabbed my shoulder. "Nothing more we can do," she said, like we were on mess duty scrubbing the kitchen. "Let's go." We got back to the lake just in time to see the fireball burst up above the wall. Aaron whistled and laughed. "Well, that was easier than I expected." "What were you expecting?" I asked. "That we'd be dead by now." "Thanks for the vote of confidence." "Take it as a compliment," she said. "Ain't just anyone I'd risk my ass for like that." Still the best compliment I've ever received. Didn't have time to dwell on it, though. We had to paddle all the way back across the lake. It was the only safe way out of there, as fire began to rain down from the sky. Every few seconds we felt the shock wave of another orbital strike wash over our heads, and the ripple pass through the water beneath us. When we got to the other shore, we stared in awe at hell we'd let loose. What had started the day as a green mountain valley was now a flaming wasteland. Well, that's war for you. Turned out the drill sergeants were right. I was corporal material after all. They gave me a medal to go with my promotion, too, although they had to pin it on me in the hospital because a week later I got shot up trying to clear a mountain tunnel. Nothing too serious. I was back on the line within a few days, but I was riding high after my big score, and it was a much-needed reminder that I was still mortal. The Golgotha campaign was a success. Finally, after years of stalemate, the lines on Gethsemane were moving again. I won't say it was all down to me, but I like to think I threw on a little of the extra weight that finally tipped the scale in our favor. At the end of our tour, they gave the whole battalion a campaign medal, but I was one of the few who were listed on the commendation rolls. I also got mentioned in a news report on a network that was interstellar. Even people all the way back on Earth saw my name. When I got back to Concord, I put the medal in my private, off-base locker where I kept my mother's jewelry and Noah's blankie. I like to think they would have been proud of me. Yukio got sent off to sniper school as soon as we got back, and we didn't see her again for 6 months. By that point, we were already fighting again on Caledonia Prime. That was a picnic compared to Golgotha. Back to Concord, then out again to Victoria, then back and forth, Nuevo Leon, then Kongu Nadu, then half a dozen other places. I've been bounced around the galaxy so much I've forgotten half the worlds I've fought on. I made sergeant before I turned 21, then first sergeant, then master sergeant. I'd like to say it was all down to talent, but it's easy to get promoted in a war that chews up people like a harvester threshing wheat. They're even talking about sending me to officer school. Not sure how I feel about that. I used to be quite a good student back on New Montana, but school in the refugee camps didn't exactly leave me with an academic mindset. They say at 25 I'm still young enough to learn. Personally, I feel old as fuck. It may be a moot point anyway. The war has shifted in our favor. We're retaking planet after planet. I'm told we even planted the flag on New Montana again, although I was on the other side of the sector, thankfully. More memories there than I care to deal with right now. We've even started pushing into enemy space. Fighting on roach worlds is a whole new kind of warfare, but we've adapted. It may not be long now before they run out of holes to crawl into. I don't know what I'll do if the war ends and I'm still alive. It never occurred to me that might happen. I'm not sure I could go back to civilian life. I've seen a hell of a lot of things no one should ever see. Then again, that was true before I joined up as well, and I found a way to cope. You know, one of the things that sticks with me, out of all the deaths and all the fear and all the insanity. On Nuevo Leon, we captured a Kurzas-Kur foot soldier. He was missing a couple of limbs and he could barely sit up, because you don't capture them if they still have the strength to fight back. But he was alive and capable of talking. We had a translator built into the comm unit, so we asked him, "Why are you fighting us?" "Because the hierarchy ordered us to." We pushed him, tried to get him to explain the reason the hierarchy gave him for the war. He didn't even understand the question. The hierarchy didn't have to explain themselves to the likes of him. They ordered, and he obeyed. From what he said before he finally kicked the bucket, That was pretty much how ordinary roaches lived their whole lives. The bosses told them what to do, and they did it. They weren't mindless drones. Some missions they enjoyed, and some they didn't. They liked getting a chance to use their knives, but they didn't like dying any more than we did. Didn't matter much either way. The idea what they liked should have some influence on what they did was, well, an alien concept to them. The roaches that killed my family didn't even know why they were doing it. They didn't choose to be there. They were just given their orders and carried them out. And they had no idea that they could do anything differently. How do you make a choice? I've had a lot of time to think about that over the years, and all I can say is that you never know if you're making the right choice or not. But you can make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. That's what counts. Maybe I'll get out of the Marines alive, and maybe I won't. But either way, joining up was the best thing I ever did. I chose to put myself on the line for the people I cared about, and I'll never regret that. Maybe you screw up sometimes, make some bad choices. It happens. But then you just try to do it right next time. The important thing is that you make a choice at all. That's what makes us human, and that's also why humanity is worth fighting for, and it's why we're going to win.